Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, wherever you're located, and welcome to CIC 2023, Celebrating International Collaboration 2023. And I'm very pleased that you're able to join us for the first of the two events that we're running during this year. The Department of Educational Research at Lancaster works with many postgraduate students and researchers, and we have many of those who are working internationally. And this is a celebration of the international academic work that our postgraduate students and researchers are undertaking in their various contexts and according to the specific studies that they're exploring. So we're very pleased that you're able to join us for this event. And we're also very pleased that we will be joined by a number of keynote speakers who will be able to add other important dimensions and perspectives to us with regard to our work on internationalization. So just as an introduction to say that I'm Don Passey. I'm the Director of International Strategy here in the Department of Educational Research. And I will be chairing this session. And as many of you know, I'm quite a stickler for time. So we will make sure that we all keep to time, I'm sure. So I'd also like to say that when speakers are presenting, please can you ensure that you have your mics on mute, and you can of course put your cameras on if you wish. If you do want to ask questions, there will be two ways in which you can do that. You can either put questions into the chat, which we will pick up, or you can wait until the end of the presentation and then raise your hand. And can I suggest that you raise your hand electronically, which is easier for us to see it with the number of people present. Can I also introduce Phil Moffat, who will be moderating this session, and Phil will be responsible for all of the recording that is being done. So we are recording many of the individual sessions. So please be aware of that. And Phil will also be responsible for picking up on any questions that you have within the chat. So without much more ado, I'd now like to hand over to Jan McArthur, who's the head of department, who'd like to also say a few words of introduction. Please, Jan.
Thank you, Don. I'd just like to welcome you all to this Department of Educational Research event. Particularly warm welcome to our doctoral students. We try and create an inclusive community, and you're an incredibly important part of it. And I think today demonstrates the way we learn from you as much as you from us. I want to particularly thank Don Passey for his work, and really this event is a real tribute to his commitment to internationalisation. We've taken a lot of different forms with our collaboration week, and I think it's lovely, Don's idea this year, to be so focused on what our doctoral students are doing. And finally, to say, I think what you all represent and what this department's ethos is that internationalisation isn't just about being in different countries. It's about that genuine, respectful engagement. And that's very much what I know we will enjoy over today and the other half day later in the week. So welcome and enjoy.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks for your kind words and introduction. So without more ado, I'm going to hand over now to our first keynote, Dr. Samia Chasi, who works in the International Education Association of South Africa, And internationalization has been a focus of Samia's work, both from a research point of view, but also from a policy and practice point of view. So, Samia, we're delighted that you're able to join us this morning and to offer your perspectives and insights. And you're going to talk on this really important question of sustainable, equitable, and just international practices. So welcome to this event. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Please.
Thank you so much, Don. Good morning from Johannesburg, South Africa, in my case. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this year's Celebrating International Collaboration event. I think it's really wonderful in the way that you have just outlined why you are doing what you're doing. And it's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be here today and to kick today's proceedings off with this keynote. Yes, as you mentioned, Don, you've not only invited me, but also asked me to speak on a specific topic, which is really very close to my heart. So I'm really quite excited to be able to do that today. And the question that you have given me to grapple with is, what are more sustainable, equitable, and just internationalization practices? But before I address this question, I think it's quite useful to provide you with a little bit more background about myself and what informs my perspectives, but also reflect on the why, to say, why do I think this is an important question for us to look at, specifically in the context of an event like the one that you're hosting today. So as you said, I've been working in international education for quite some time. In fact, I started in the international office of my home university, that is Rostock University in Germany, in 1999. I was born and educated in Germany, but I've lived in South Africa for more than 20 years. And so my perspectives are very much informed by both the global North and the global South contexts. For most of my professional life, I've worked with or at universities and organizations that foster and promote international collaboration and partnerships. And as you mentioned, I'm currently based at the International Education Association of South Africa, or short IEASA. IEASA is a nonprofit organization that was established in 1997, and it works with the public universities in the country to advance internationalization of higher education with an African perspective, but in a global context. So the points and views that I share today are really informed by my experiences, specifically here in South Africa, most notably my work at IEASA and the networks that I have to colleagues in the country. But of course, as you mentioned, Don, also my own research. I was a PhD student once, not so long ago. I completed my studies in 2019 at Wits University here in Johannesburg. And I looked into North-South partnerships in higher education. So again, I will also be able to draw on my studies and my research and the work that I've been doing since. So thank you again for this opportunity to join you today. A few things I would like to highlight right from the start that are important, I think, in understanding what I will be talking about. And that is that when I look at internationalization of higher education, I specifically focus on global South experiences and lived realities. And I am also, and that is perhaps a given in the South African context, informed and shaped by what I would call a decolonial lens and a decolonial approach to internationalization and higher education in general. And that leaves room for, or provides room for, critical reflections and critical approaches. But it also, I think, gives us a framework for bringing about positive change. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. My point of departure for this conversation today really is that I think we've reached a point where we can no longer conduct business as usual. We have understood that internationalization is a global phenomenon that affects universities around the world, but it affects them very differently. And I think the COVID pandemic was one of those moments where, we had an opportunity to pause and reflect on our internationalization practices. And we've realized that there is a lot of work that needs to be done. And that, in fact, sustainability, equity, and justice are often lacking in internationalization practices, and particularly in partnerships practices. And that is, as I said, an observation that we make that is very much informed by a global South perspective and the realities that we face working with and at universities that are based in the global South. So how and what can we do to change that, and change that hopefully for the better? I'd like to start my reflections by focusing on two examples. I'm, as you said, also a practitioner in the field, so I really always like to try and give something very concrete and specific for us to grapple with. And I thought I will use two examples of internationalization practice, one around internationalization conferences and the other one specifically focusing on collaboration and partnerships, honoring the theme of your event. So when it comes to conferences, I want to say that what I'm going to share here is also very much linked to a recently published article that is titled "Towards More Sustainable, Equitable and Just Internationalization Practices, the Case of Internationalization Conferences." And I co-published and co-authored this article with my colleague, Dr. Savo Heleta. We wrote this piece in response to a call for proposals that we saw for a special issue of the Journal of Studies in International Education that specifically wanted to explore the link between internationalization and environmental sustainability. So that's kind of like the first connection that I make here between internationalization and sustainability, and specifically environmental sustainability. So this gave us an opportunity to look at and critically interrogate the contribution that internationalization makes to the destruction of the climate and our planet, and to look at internationalization practices that are specifically harmful to the environment and to the planet. And we specifically zoomed in on practices that rely on air travel, because air travel is one of the fastest growing sources of greenhouse gas emissions and a big contributor to the climate challenge that we are facing. And this, of course, in terms of our internationalization practices, is particularly important in the context of short-term mobility. You know, when we travel to attend conferences or give a guest lecture or participate in a recruitment fair. And as we are all not only researching in this field, but very many of us, I think, also really working here, this is an opportunity to critically reflect on our own practice and our own contributions. The second link that I would like to talk about briefly is the link between internationalization and equity. And this is really something that occurred to us while we were writing this article, specifically when we looked at the data. And we had decided to focus on the attendance patterns of in-person conferences that were hosted by the three big internationalization associations, NAFSA in the United States, EAE in Europe, and API in the Asia Pacific region. And we looked at pre-COVID data. So this was attendance in 2019. And we discovered that the distribution of international opportunities and mobility flows is really very unequal, and that there is a strong dominance of global North countries and institutions that are present at these events. And while we were digging deeper into this, we realized that we can draw parallels between inequities that we see in internationalization and those that exist in the climate change conversation. Insofar as the contribution to climate change is predominantly something that global North institutions are responsible for, and the consequences of climate change are disproportionately felt by communities and people in the global South. And just to give you an example that relates to the data that we dealt with, we found that 15% of academics and scholars and practitioners are responsible for 70% of air travel linked to international conferences. And I think that's an example of where we have to accept that we have a responsibility to look at our own practices and bring about that change that we seek. And that, of course, is also then connected to a conversation around how internationalization links with justice concerns. So justice comes in here in the context of acknowledging and wanting to tackle challenges and inequalities. I think it also means that we have to understand that internationalization does not exist in a vacuum. It's not something that is apolitical or ahistorical. We have to really critically engage with this phenomenon and see what it means to us today, how that has been informed by the past and what that hopefully means for the future. So changing the status quo, a certain degree of activism, I think, is important in that context so that we can bring about positive change for hopefully more sustainable futures for all of us. The second example that I want to quickly reflect on is relates to the context of collaboration and partnerships. And as I mentioned, this is really something that I've worked in all my professional life. My studies also looked into partnerships in particular, and North-South partnerships specifically. And so I want to just briefly reflect on how and in what ways international collaboration is not sustainable, equitable, and just, and therefore I think needs to be changed. And so again, I'm specifically looking at this from the perspective of institutions that are based in the Global South and work with their counterparts in the Global North. And here again, we come to the fact that we need to consider equity and justice concerns. International collaboration is really very often framed as something that is quite challenging, particularly in the context of North-South and South-North engagements, which are very often characterized by imbalances and inequalities when it comes to resources, for example, when it comes to power dynamics, and when it comes to knowledge generation as well. There are some that have highlighted the very extractive nature that we sometimes see in North-South engagements, where there is a flow of people and talents primarily from the South to the North. This, of course, links to brain drain concerns and conversations. But some have actually said, for example, specifically in research partnerships, that there is an extraction of raw data. Data is being collected in the South and is being analyzed and theorized in the North. And some have equated this extraction of raw data to the extraction of raw materials that happened under colonialism. And in fact, some colleagues ask, is internationalization of higher education as we know it a form of recolonization in higher education? So these are also some critical questions that I think we have to address. In my study, specifically, I found that international activities, international partnerships tend to benefit Northern partners disproportionately more than Southern partners. And I think in the context of mobility agreements, for example, where students are being moved, we very often find that these engagements are not reciprocal, that more Northern students travel to the South than the other way around. We also see inequities and inequalities in research collaborations. And if there's time at the end, we can perhaps explore that a little bit further. Another point that I wanted to mention that I think relates more to the sustainability aspect of this conversation is that from the perspective of the South, again, many partnerships many engagements with partnerships with institutions in the North require funding. And very often this funding is also being made available by Northern organizations and funding funders. And that often there is an expectation that a project will, be sustainable beyond the end of a particular, beyond the end of that particular project. But very often, I think that's not a very realistic expectation. So that's one of the concerns that we have to look at in terms of sustainability, when we don't necessarily look at it in terms of environmental sustainability, but the ability to maintain something over a certain period of time. Another concern that I have when it comes to sustainability is that I think when a partnership is not based on an equal footing, then often there is a lack of ownership, particularly of those partners that are not involved. In my case, or in my experience, very often the Global South partners, and that is also something that negatively affects sustainability. I have in the past years been involved in a number of evaluations of funding proposals that were submitted by European universities for collaboration and projects with partners in the Global South. And I think where there are instances where the involvement of Global South partners is limited, for example, to things like student recruitment or being the destination for field studies or internships, that really is something that does not bode well for the long-term impact and the long-term sustainability of a project like that. So these are some of the challenges that I have particularly experienced and seen and researched. And now I think it's time to ask, so what? What can we do about this? I think it's really important for us to reimagine internationalization and to do that together, as a form of collaboration itself. I think it's important that we come together to think, how can we collectively engage in more sustainable, equitable, and just internationalization practices? And the first thing I think that we need to do here is to really critically reflect on our own attitudes, our own approaches, our own practices, and to really ask, who benefits from what we are doing, who loses out, how and why. That is, I think, important for partnerships, but even at events like an internationalization conference, can I ask myself who's in the room and who's not here, and why, and what can we perhaps do to change that? And so I think that is linked again to that second point that I want to make, that is so important for me if we want to talk about what can we do, is taking action. Really commit to something that we can all do, and that can be different things depending on where we are based in our institutions and organizations, what our sphere of influence is, etc. But I do believe that we all have a part to play. And so, for example, if we look at how can we reduce the carbon footprint of internationalization conferences, events, and partnership activities, I think the first thing to say is we need to travel less, particularly if we are part of what in our article we described as hypermobile elites. And those are both academic and professional elites, that travel to numerous events every year for a few days to different regions of the globe. I think we have to really very critically rethink that as a practice. So travel less or travel differently. I hope that many of you have heard of CANI, the Climate Action Network of International Educators, for example, who, just recently during the EAIE conference that was hosted in the Netherlands, really set out to say, can we not fly? Can we take the train, or can we use different modes of transport? That's another way, I think, of doing it. Moving activities online, having conversations like the one that we are having right now. And I know, when I spoke to Don as a kind of like a short preparatory meeting, you explained to me that your students are based all over the world. And it's important that we now recognize that we can engage in online activities. I think in terms of teaching and learning, to really shift away from the necessity to move people around physically, to create opportunities for virtual exchanges and virtual engagement, and developing programs such as COIL, collaborative online international learning, etc. So I think it's increasingly important that we engage in these kind of practices when it comes to international collaboration and exchange. Then coming more to the partnership side, I think there's also a couple of things that we need to consider and hopefully do. And I think the most important one is that we need to commit to changing the modes of engagement in our collaboration and partnerships, and to really center mutuality, and to make sure that in everything that we do, everybody who is involved in the project gets something out of it, benefits from it in a particular way. And these benefits can be asymmetrical. It doesn't have to be an eye for an eye. It really is something that needs to be negotiated to see what is it that everybody actually brings to this partnership, but also what is it that everybody needs, and how can you create positive outcomes for everyone who's involved. And that, for example, in the context of North-South partnerships, means to include Global South partners in all key aspects of a collaboration or a partnership right from the start, from conceptualization and design to implementation, and then also dissemination. And dissemination is an important part, especially when we talk about research engagements and research partnerships, for example. We've seen so many instances where, wonderful projects happen. Global North institutions work with partners in the Global South. And when the project comes to an end, it's the Global North colleagues that write it up and publish something about it. And, the Southern institutions very often miss out. And I think that's a real challenge that we also have to tackle, specifically in the context of joint research. I think it's important to champion inclusion and to increase access and participation for underrepresented institutions and individuals. And just to give you a brief context of what that means for associations such as IEASA, for example, we operate in a higher education environment that is very divided and very unequal in terms of the legacies of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa. So to this day, we operate with categories such as historically advantaged and historically disadvantaged institutions. And when it comes to internationalization, those disadvantaged institutions need our support and our encouragement because they don't have as extensive and long-standing partnerships as some of the advantaged institutions. But we also, for example, need to look at inclusion in the context of urban universities and universities that are located in urban centers and their rural counterparts, to encourage international delegations, for example, to experience a rural campus and not always only concentrate on the few usual suspects that are located in Johannesburg or in Cape Town or in Durban. And then, of course, we also have, for example, research-intensive universities and universities of technology. And, often there is this kind of like a two-tier approach to these institutions that is absolutely not justified. So it's, for example, important in our advocacy work that we represent the sector as a whole. And so just to say the last point that I want to mention here that I think is very important for all of us is that when we recognize privilege, that we acknowledge that we have it and that we consider how we can repurpose it, how we can share opportunities that are available to us with others. Conference travel, for example, is one of those. And so I think that there is really something that we can all do. I think we all have agency, and I would really like to encourage everyone who's joined us today or who will listen to the recording to think, does what I have said here resonate with any of you, with your backgrounds, with your institutional and national contexts, with your professional and personal experiences? Are there any challenges that you experience? Is there anything you can do about it? And importantly, what can we do together to develop different internationalization practices? And I think we have a lot to gain from that in the sense that we are able to make a contribution not only to our partnerships and collaborations, but to more sustainable, equitable, and just global societies and global communities. And I think that is really important if we want to make a contribution to a better future for everybody. And I'd like to conclude by sharing an African proverb with you that I think really encapsulates this message and this encouragement. And it goes like this: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samia. Thank you for kicking off this event so admirably. And certainly there were a lot of things there that would resonate with me. I'm certainly trying to cut down on the travel. That's for sure. Having been at one time, I think I was quoted some years ago as being the most traveled person in the university, whereas now that's definitely not the case. So I'm pleased that I've come down at least a step or two in that direction, and will continue to do that. There are many things that I could pick up, but I'm going to make sure that other folk have chance to pick up and comment and ask you questions within the time. So I know that we have a couple of hands up here. Hilary, you're the first one to kick off, please.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much, Samia, for such a thought-provoking start to the morning. I wanted to pick up on the point that you said about traveling to conferences via train, because I'm just thinking about this theme that you were talking about of center and periphery and who gets to go to conferences and so on. And I do worry that will then privilege continental places that are easy to get to. So for context, a few years ago, my country of origin, Malta, was supposed to host a big international conference and it was cancelled due to COVID. Happens to everybody. But now that organization has said they're only going to prioritize cities that can be reached by train, because for climate reasons and all the reasons you spoke about. So then I think, well, that means an island country like Malta is never going to host again. And so do we risk then that we're privileging then the capitals like Berlin, Paris, places that can be got to, and reinforcing the periphery of other states? Obviously, I think climate should come first, because if you have no planet to do academia on anyway, then it's all irrelevant. But I just wanted to raise this tension and see what you think of this challenge and some ideas we could use to overcome it. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Hilary. I think this, you've put your finger right on it. There are no easy solutions. All of these challenges that we are facing are so very complex. And I think this is a very important point that you note. Also in South Africa, really, hardly anybody travels by train, especially international visitors. They will come here and they will fly. We also know that in Europe, for example, it is a lot easier to convince people to hop on a train because there are actually connections, etc., etc. But apart from the practicality of whether it's possible or not, and whether it's affordable or not, and what it means for someone to travel, if traveling means, for example, that you spend 3 days on a journey instead of maybe half a day or something, that's also quite a difference, and quite a commitment that we would expect. But I think the point that you raised is really an important one. And in the context of hosting an event, I think it will be important to take all these different considerations into mind and to say, is it perhaps possible? And we have been doing that to some extent to say, can you, if you do have a conference that happens annually, can you alternate, can you take one center the one year and the other one, you're really encouraging people, to go into places where they would normally not go. And we have done that, and some of the organizations that are based here have done that quite successfully. I think also really the idea of hosting events annually is something that we need to reconsider. I don't think there's really any need, for that, especially in the internationalization context where people who are privileged and who can afford to go to a few events every year, and more or less, yes, the attendance changes, but not dramatically, I would argue, that you really perhaps can go to one event the one year and another the next year, etc. Or we have even argued that why can't we have a global event that everybody then goes to, So those kind of, I think, questions and concerns are things that we need to consider. Ultimately, I think to bring it back to what you said, it's really also not something where you can find a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think it's important, especially around the commitment to inclusion, to say, what does that mean? And how can we include those kind of institutions that are perhaps in places and those individuals that would otherwise not have an opportunity to participate? And I think that's also important in terms of access, yeah. And in part, the privileging conversation around conference attendance in particular is also to say, one of the examples that I have shared in that regard is, very often when we go to conferences, we sit in presentations where colleagues talk about the projects that they have done, very often North-South collaboration projects, and it's always the Global North partners that are there to present because the Southern partners can either not afford to come, So I think those are also things that we need to consider. Who can speak on behalf of somebody, on behalf of a collaboration, on behalf of a partnership? So there are really very many things to be taken into account, but these are really just a few.
Okay, thanks, Hilary, for the question, and thanks, Samia, for the response. I'm very conscious of time.
Mm-hmm.
And we're coming to the end of this first slot. I don't know whether there were any other questions that came through the chat, Phil, but I wonder whether if there were, whether they might be answered via chat. Phil, have you any comments on that?
There are compliments, Samia. There are questions, merely compliments.
Thank you.
I wonder if I might just say, just for a couple of minutes, just as a good news story, having looked at your work myself I'm doing a long-term research project for sustainability education in the built environment, what the global North can learn from the global South. And people were surprised at the interventionist aspects of that, which were disappointing at first. But having looked at some of your work. We found this unshakable problem related to what you described as extraction, where a lot of researchers were seeing the global south and particularly indigenous built environments as a lucrative source of data rather than as a lucrative source of epistemic development, particularly in those indigenous built environments. But having looked at your work, you know, we made sure that we built in right from the not the ethnographic stuff, right from the start, we built that in. So, you know, there is some good news there for what we can learn for vernacular design. So thank you. We do.
Oh, and thank you for sharing that. That is really very encouraging. And there are so many initiatives, you know, really around the globe. I have been very fortunate that I've been able to engage with many colleagues, also in global north, you know, destinations. We've discussed decolonization, for example, in Canada, in Germany, in Belgium, in Finland, you know, and all of those conversations are really so important. And I do think that things are changing, for many not fast enough and not dramatically and radically enough, but I think it is important that we make every contribution that we can to changing the status quo. And I think that's, you know, where I really believe, as I said, that we all have a part to play and we all can do something. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Phil, and thanks, Samia, and thanks so much for such a wonderful introduction to this event and for raising so many important questions for us, which I'm sure will, you know, we will continue to explore and wish to explore, not only during this event but further. And yes, if there, you know, do if you have chance, do please stay with us for this event if you have time, and we'd very much welcome that, and thank you for the opportunity to engage with us. Thank you. So next